the Pet Health and Happiness podcast from Bella+Duke, keeping you at the cutting edge of pet nutrition, behaviour and health with expert interviews, mythbusters and more to help your pet lead a healthier, happier life.
Welcome everybody. My name is Rowan Sanderson. I'm the CNO, Chief Nutritional Officer here at Bella+Duke, and I am very pleased and proud to welcome Dr. Brendan Clarke, President of the RFVS, Raw Feeding Veterinary Society. Dr. Brendan, welcome.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Fabulous. This week, we're going to cover, can my dog eat cooked food and some of the benefits of raw feeding? So, Dr. Brendan, without further ado, can my dog eat cooked food? This is a really good question which gets asked by so many people who want to join raw. Can dogs do that?
Yeah, so it's a common question for me as well in practice. It's very common that people are always slightly anxious when they're maybe first embarking on raw, and they want to know if there's an interim stage and what the problems may be. And so they'll ask about cooking foods, and there's lots of fresh options out there that actually advocate some cooking of foods as well. So it's really interesting talking to a lot of my colleagues in this field with regards to raw and then the cooked foods. And yes, they can have cooked foods. I mean, of course they can. I mean, we have had them surviving for eons, for millennia on raw options. We've had them for a couple of hundred years, maybe just under a couple of hundred years, surviving on cooked stuff that we've started to produce for them. And actually, we are seeing that they're surviving. Now, whether they're thriving is another matter. And that's the point that we are in the RFVS really trying to push is, are we actually giving them species appropriate feeding, especially in the cooked lines that are available commercially? 70 to 100 degrees in a low simmer in things like bone broth, for example, that can actually help some of those nutrients be released from that bone material. When we're talking about roasting and high heat cooking, that can have some deleterious effects with regards to looking at the formation of acrylamides, which can be carcinogenic, looking at the oxidization of foods, looking at the format in which the proteins may change and their exposure to the immune system. So many things that can change within the foods if we overcook or extreme temperature cook foods that can be problematic.
Right. So that's really interesting. You covered quite a lot there, actually. So I'm going to try and break that down slightly. And as I understand it, for those people who don't perhaps have your level of science or your clinical experience, and here's a quick question, Brendan. How long have you been advocating raw?
Oh, over 20 years now. So I've been a vet for over 25 years, joined the current practice in West Yorkshire as an assistant vet, became a partner within that first year, and as a practice, we've been advocating raw food feeding since early 90s, and myself through the late 90s all the way through. So over 20 years of experience in advising on raw.
Wow. So just going back to this, can my dog eat cooked food? Yes, they can. The dogs are ultimately, as I understand it, they're scavengers. They're designed to be able to survive on lots of things. But realistically, raw is the species appropriate diet which a dog's biology has evolved to digest and assimilate nutrients from.
Yeah, look, as I said earlier, the eons that, as a species they've developed, they've not been having everything cooked for them. They've maybe had some waste stuff given by, left behind by humans, but the majority of stuff is raw caught. and that may be from rabbits and small rodents, etc., through to birds, and getting on to larger animals, especially carcasses that may be from ill animals, etc. But ultimately, we have recently changed diets for our convenience, and that's not something that's necessarily species appropriate. Convenience and species appropriate feeding doesn't necessarily always go hand in hand, and that includes for us too. And what we at the RFVS really want to push going forwards, and I think for many raw food feeding companies, is actually looking at what is not just a species appropriate diet, but what's a healthier diet. And when we're talking as nutritionists, talking about human foods, if you go to somebody who's advising you on nutrition, and you say, I'm eating 10 takeaways a week, and I've got a slight weight problem, and I'm feeling really tired and lethargic, probably the first thing they're going to advocate doing is increasing the amount of fresh, raw foods that you're taking, whole foods. And realistically, we want to try and advise a bit more on how to do that safely for our canine companions.
Yeah, now this is a really, really interesting subject. I think for the sake of people being able to square this away and understand it, there's a huge difference between surviving and thriving. There's a huge difference between absence of symptoms and optimal health. And I can't quite remember who mentioned this in one of our recent discussions, but they used the amazing term about putting more life into your dog. And it was just so lovely to see. So maybe there's two ways we can look at this. What are the downsides of cooking food, and what are the benefits of feeding raw? Now, what, for instance, happens to protein when it is cooked? For instance, when we're looking at specific dog food, which is what they call ultra-processed food now, what are just a couple of takeaway things that can happen to protein?
Okay, so we look at proteins. Proteins for the general public out there are made up of little building blocks from amino acids, okay, that are read off from your genetic code. Proteins make up everything that's functional within your system, from the enzymes that help digestion and actually to build up other materials within your system, to the muscle fibers that keep you walking, through to the structures of your organs to keep your kidneys working, keep your liver working. All of those things are protein based. There are some other substances around that, but ultimately you need to understand that proteins built up from amino acids joined together in short strings, what we call peptides, in larger strings become these proteins. And they aren't just a 2D line of structure. They actually, with electrical charge and with their structure of where the hydrogen ions are and everything else on the amino acids, and how those amino acids are grouped together, will actually twist and shape into a 3D structure, which is the protein itself. Now, if you take that and you put it through a high heat process, you will have some of those bonds change within that structure. You'll have some breakdown of the protein. You'll have some of the kinks and the lumps of 3D structure straighten out, break, harden up, take different form. And so there's a few things that can then challenge us with as we go forwards. One of which is that some of those end products through high heat process can actually irritate the system so much that they become what we call carcinogens. They are cancer forming. So some of the acrylamides and things like that. There are other things that can happen that they actually can irritate the gut lining. They can penetrate in a format that will mean that the immune system is heightened against them. because of the types of protein structures that they are. And that can lead to other things all the way through to allergy that often people have misdiagnosed with, but will suspect their dogs have if they've got any form of gastric upset or skin problem.
So this is really interesting. So by excessively cooking protein, or just simply by cooking protein and processing it and all of these things that's going on, there are cancer-forming substances. The dog can get an irritated immune system, which I guess creates inflammation. And it can in turn lead to intolerances or allergies or sensitivities, depending. I think you very kindly explained to me a couple of weeks ago that ultimately the dog's immune system can perceive cooked protein different to a raw protein. It won't recognize them as the same thing. And
very much, yeah, I mean, it is very much around the shape that it's looking at. So the immune system produces hundreds of thousands of millions of shapes of antibodies, and it's about how does that key, which is the substance, the protein in this case, the allergen, how does it fit into that protein structure, which is the antibodies? And at that point, if it's recognized, the cells that are attached there will start to produce loads of those antibodies in excess, to a point where you will have absolute millions of antibodies floating around to try and find something that fits that exact shape again. So as I explained slightly earlier, if you change that shape through cooking, then what you will have is that shape is, usually in a polypeptide or protein structure, if of that size, if that shape is accurately enough a fit, then you will excite that immune system.
The dog's immune system, it can see protein differently, it perceives it because it's got these specific antigens which it produces to specific shaped proteins. Now, for those people at home, that's quite important, isn't it? Because they can often come to raw feeding and think their dog has an allergy to chicken, for instance. And when they start raw feeding, they notice that these symptoms go away because the immune system is seeing it differently. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, so it's very much around shape. Okay, and if you change the shape through cooking, then you will have a different exposure. So if that patient has an irritated gut, it's only going to actually cause an immune response, an adaptive immune response with antibodies, if it actually leaks in that structure through the gut wall. Now, in normal digestive processes, that should not happen. Okay, and they should break that protein down into amino acids and polypeptides, which will be absorbed normally through the cells. The issue that can come is that if the walls between the cells start to part because of irritation and inflammation, then the proteins can pass directly through and cause the situation with the immune system where the shape of the protein may be adjusted by cooking, so that it will be a different shape, will actually excite the immune system and cause a problem. So we've got to try and do a few things with healing the gut when we're feeding a more natural diet, reducing the level of leakage that's going through the gut wall, and then on top of that, getting them to a protein structure that could often be different if it's still raw, to a point where the body's immune system that's been pre-recognizing that cooked chicken, I think you gave us an example, will no longer see the raw chicken as the same shape. So that's a way around it. There are some other things that the commercial food companies can sometimes do to try and reduce the cooked chicken shape, and that is something called hydrolysis, so super processing the food. So that reduces the protein down to such small blocks that the immune system doesn't recognize it. But that's effectively accentuating processing of the foods and food is not just protein, that can leave you with other problems, and that the food does tend to start to look a little bit more like cardboard than it does look like.
Now, I spoke to a very exciting scientist that I will not name yet because I've not asked his permission, but he's the professor who discovered glutamate. And he was saying to me that in all likelihood, that when these proteins are hydrolyzed, it may provoke bad behavior and behavioral issues in dogs. Why? Because it's creating a surge of these very, very excitatory neurotransmitters in the dogs. And actually, in our group of over 12,500 people, that's one of the things that people consistently tell us, is that their dog seems more calm and more focused when moving on to a raw diet. And I guess, Dr. Brennan, is that a kind of a good thing for us to move on to and tap into some of your experience and just cover some of the top benefits of raw feeding?
Yeah, I think there's some important elements when you're talking about behaviour for our dogs, and it is of paramount importance for all vets. We hold the welfare of our patients in the highest most regard. That's one of the most important elements we're looking at when we're looking at, is there a treatment option ahead of us which is going to keep their welfare in mind. When we're talking about food and feeding, I think it's really important that we're looking at how we can help reinforce natural behavior, because that's one of the 5 freedoms, to make sure that the animals that we're looking after have the freedom to exhibit natural behavior. And so eating raw food, including bone material, carcass material, can be really important, not just for the dental health, but actually for their mental health. And I think those are really important elements to look at. So there's a physicality of eating raw that actually brings some important behavioural changes. And I've had many people say, oh, my dog's a working dog, I don't want it ripping carcasses apart on the field or anything like that. That'd be a really terrible situation to be in. And actually, I've been advising people with working dogs about how to feed raw, because actually some of them have typical spaniels. I've got a spaniel down by my side right now, and she's actually snoozing because she gets very bored of me talking, and she very much is calmer rather than more excited for the fact that she is raw fed, 100% raw fed, even to the point of whole carcass where it's possible. Now, that doesn't mean that she then goes out killing everything. That just means that what she does is she's got focused energy. So she can run and run and run and run. So she has lots of boundless energy. But when she wants to come home and relax, she snoozes, she sleeps. She's quite happy to spend 12 hours snoozing while I'm working. And that's fine for her, as long as she gets regular sort of interaction and breaks, but the most of the time she's snoozing. That's what it should be like for them. And so there's the element of physicality, there's the element of when they take these foods on board, that they have more focused energy. And when they're taking that on, it's not just about the breakdown, the hydrolysis of protein. Has that caused this excessive amounts of glutamate? It's often down to when you've got these super processed foods, sometimes the change of shape of those proteins means that as they're digesting them, maybe that they are producing an end product which can only be used for energy, can't be used for the building blocks that the body needs, but actually has a need to be, well, I can't really reuse that. It's almost like that one-use plastic. All I can do now is burn it to get some energy out of it. And, humans thought that was a great thing for us to have excess energy in the food. It allowed us to do some other stuff rather than just having to concentrate all our energy on hunting and getting the next meal, that we could start to invent things and things like that. Unfortunately, we're now in the Western world where we've got an 80% resting rate of obesity. And that's unfortunately also been forced upon our pets. And so having excess energy in the diet isn't necessarily where we want to be right now. We want better nutrition, better absorption, better utilization and efficiency of what we're taking in. And so you've also got to understand those proteins aren't just helping the body and being absorbed and digested by that, but also by our microbiome, another pet subject that I love to talk about. And that's the friendly bacteria and organisms that help us, produce hormones, produce enzymes, produce nutrients that enhance our body's ability to go through life. And that also has a very important role in production and absorption of things like L-tryptophan, some of the precursors of serotonin, and that's an important hormone within the brain that helps, again, keep your pet calm. So if you have something that's enhancing the microbiome, enhancing the health of your animal, then generally, they are calmer, more balanced, more ready to get up and go, but not constantly pecking at you to do the next thing, sort of animals. And that's what we want. That's our beloved pets.
Love this. Dr. Brendan, thank you so much. Really, whether by accident or by design, I'm going to credit you with design. What I love is we've actually come to the crux of this, which all pet guardians, owners, whichever we want to call them, really want. And that's the happiness of their pet. And you touched on this. I think it's such a lovely concept and so important, is the 5 freedoms. And I'm going to come back to that in just one second. But if they're producing all these calm neurotransmitters, by definition, they're happier. If they are not being overfed with energy, but actually getting a nutrient-dense food, they have everything they need to repair, to be able to go out and play and live joyfully, but they also have a much calmer mind. So we've talked ultimately about their mental health, and we all know that a dog is super pacified with a bone. It's a calming thing for them. It's a natural behavior. Their physical health, but also just their general happiness. I think it's a beautiful trilogy for us to all aim towards. Can you take us through the 5 freedoms? What are they?
Okay, so the 5 freedoms, well, they're trying to add more, but generally the 5 freedoms are looked at as the gold standard of welfare. So if you go on the RSPCA website, you'll be able to find them. If you go on the British Veterinary Association website, you'll be able to find them for their welfare organisations. Pretty much anything that's to do with animal welfare will talk about the 5 freedoms, from farm animals all the way through to pets and zoo animals. So it's really important understanding. So they run through, one, that they have the freedom from discomfort, so obvious suffering. You should not be allowing an animal under your care to be suffering in any way. And that's, discomfort is how they name that. The freedom to exhibit natural behavior I've talked about on these casts, and ultimately, feeding is one of those important ones. So, we often, as a profession, will advocate in exotic species that it's so important to allow them to exhibit natural behavior in feeding. But actually, that should be extended across the range to farm animals, to pet animals. And so we should, as a profession, as a community, as a civilization, be saying, that's an important freedom to make sure that they're allowed to express natural behavior. Shelter is really important, so that animals are not just left out to be exposed to the weather elements, that they should be given shelter. They should have freedom from thirst, so they should not be deprived of access to water and those elements. And the freedom from disease, so we shouldn't be allowing animals under our care to be suffering from disease without treatment. So it's really important that we are looking at those animals that have an ailment and endeavouring to make sure those are treated so it's not a chronic disease, a long-term disease.
Wow. Just listening to this, it makes me think that, well, frankly, we're almost obliged to feed raw to animals, knowing that we've seen a lower incidence of disease. We see animals recover from disease. We see animals having better energy and mental health, and it fits within their natural behaviors. This isn't really an angle we often cover. We talk about, smaller stools or less IBS or glossier fur or more energy or brighter teeth, which are all really important because they're symptoms or external indicators. But actually at the core of it, the animal's happiness is being able to eat the food that it's evolved to eat.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so important. And yeah, it's an angle that I've looked at through my passions for animal behaviour, looking at welfare as a vet, and yeah, I sometimes am amazed that some of my colleagues don't necessarily see things in that light. They sort of skip over the behaviour stuff and are far more interested in, we're making sure that they're fed, that they are getting nutrition of some description. So, as far as we're concerned, that's as far as they need to go.
Fabulous. Dr. Brendan. And of course, we'll break the news here. We were both shared with this weekend some amazing new research which has come out of the dog risk people in the University of Helsinki, Dr. Anna Hjelm-Bjorkman, who's shown that dogs are a lot less likely to have itchy skin, or as they call it, canine atopic dermatitis, if they're raw fed as puppies. So that leads us on to a topic we'll cover in the next episode, is feeding puppies and can they eat raw. But I think we'll leave it there for this week, and thank you very much for your time. Dr. Brendan, what a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure's mine too. It's been great speaking to you, Rowan.
Thank you. See you next week.
Okay, take care.